So in this session, we're going to begin Chapter 3 of Superbloom, How Technologies of Connection Tear Us Apart by Nicholas Carr. Chapter 3 of Part 1 is titled The Feed. Quick explanation, I just got back from picking up my new glasses. I have some of these recordings are out of order because the first 3 chapters I did not record when I first read them. Then I decided to record the book, so I've kind of gone back as I've recorded the subsequent chapters. I've also gone back and been trying to catch up those first 3. So this is the last one that I'm catching up on, and so reading this with my new glasses, I'm going to test drive these new glasses and see how it changes my reading to where I won't be so blurry at times, hopefully, and with my new prescription. And then when you watch chapters 4, 5, 6, and 7, those are going to be with my old glasses. Chapter 8 will be with my new ones. Understand? And that's why I'm all dressed up, because I just got back from the eye doctor. All right, so Chapter 3, The Feed. Mixed media. If you were to travel back in time to 1978, the year the Supreme Court decided the Carlin case, and walk through the front door of a typical middle-class American home, you might think you had entered a media museum. The entire modern history of communication technology would be on display. There'd be bookcases with hardcovers and paperbacks. The morning paper would be spread out on the kitchen table. Magazines would be lying about, their titles, Time, Money, Life, testifying to the publishing industry's bygone swagger. You'd see envelopes and postage stamps, library cards, film cameras, and photo albums, a typewriter, radios of various sizes. Mounted on the kitchen wall would be a communal telephone, and there might be another phone or two on bedside tables in the bedrooms. In the living room, you'd find a bulky color TV, a wire snaking out the back and up to an aerial on the roof. There'd be a stereo, turntable and receiver, 8-track or cassette deck, speakers, and records and tapes to play on it. There might even be, if there were teenagers in the house, a newfangled Atari 2600 video game console. We remember the mass media era as a time of uniformity. Everyone saw the same hit movies and TV shows, listened to the same top 40 songs, read the same wire service news reports. But what we forget is that it was also a time of great formal variety in the tools and artifacts of communication. Media spoke in many voices through devices designed to suit particular modes of expression. There was a constant press to come up with new methods to record, store, and transmit information, and because different kinds of information took different physical forms, those methods branched out in many directions. Communication devices were specialized, like hand tools or kitchen gadgets. You couldn't record an orchestra on a typewriter, or take a photograph with a telephone, or mail a letter through a radio. And while technically you could broadcast the text of a novel through a TV or project it onto a movie screen, no one wanted to read it that way. The technologies overlapped in places. Words and pictures could be printed with the same machine onto the same sheet of paper. Radio programs could be distributed to stations through phone lines. Tape recorders could make copies of vinyl records, but that just added to the diversity of what we retrospectively call analog media. Back then it was just media. No one had cause to use the adjective analog until the adjective digital came along. The businesses that coalesced around the different methods of communication were specialized as well, with different capital and labor requirements, patterns of competition, and regulatory regimes. You didn't get your news and your music and your shows from the same company. Within each general category of content, text, sound, image, motion picture, came further differentiation and specialization. Text took many forms. Personal letters, handwritten or typed, were sent through the mail. Telegrams were transmitted over wires and delivered by courier. Newspapers were printed on rolls of cheap newsprint, cut and folded into tabloid or broadsheet format, and distributed by newsagents and paperboys. Magazines were printed on glossier paper and mailed to subscribers or sold by the issue in shops. Books were printed on still more durable stock, glued or stitched into bindings, and sold in bookstores or through book clubs. And then there were catalogs, greeting cards, comic books, memoranda, faxes, and on and on. And that kind of, the first time I read this, that kind of threw me, and it still does. I want to check on this because I don't remember there being faxes in 1978. Maybe I'm wrong about that. I'll see. Sound media were nearly as various. Telephones converted voices into electric signals and transmitted them at first with the aid of operators, then automatically through an intricate network of wires and switches. Calls could be local, long distance, or international, each involving different carriers and billing schemes. Songs, symphonies, speeches, and jokes were etched into the grooves of vinyl discs or magnetized onto tapes and sold through record stores and department stores or loaded into jukeboxes. The same recordings were played over the radio, along with live shows, news reports, advertisements, and the patter of announcers and DJs. Images, still or moving, circulated in myriad forms too, some printed or photocopied, some projected onto screens in theaters, some broadcast to home TVs, some slipped into children's viewmasters. Taming the flood. The distinctions between media were not just technical, industrial, and legal. They were semantic, cultural, and aesthetic. With distinctions in form came distinctions in meaning. Think of the various media used for interpersonal communication. If you wanted to correspond or converse with someone, you had a lot of options. You could mail a handwritten or typed letter or a postcard. You could make a phone call. You could send a wire or a fax. Each medium entailed a different style of expression, a different degree of timeliness, a different level of intimacy, and a different set of social norms and expectations. When you chose a medium, you also chose a way of speaking. The medium was part of the conversation. Or think of news and its many formats. Delivered daily, a newspaper had immediacy and breadth, with a stress on getting the facts about important events out as quickly as possible. There were well-delineated sections, local, domestic, international, sports, business, arts, weather, to give coherency to the reports and aid the reader in navigating them. Weekly news magazines provided more perspective and context, filtering out lesser stories and adding reportorial depth to more salient ones. Monthlies, or slicks, added still more color and personality, with immaculately reproduced photographs and long thematic think pieces that tied events and ideas together. Broadcasters built up their own news organizations, a legacy of the fairness doctrine's requirement that they cover public issues. On television, half-hour news programs aired around dinner time provided fast-paced, visual summaries of the day's events. Talk shows such as 60 Minutes and Meet the Press offered longer reports on topics and controversies of the moment, often including interviews with public figures. TV bulletins were reserved for momentous events, an assassination, an airliner crash. Radio news offered a bit of everything, with some stations broadcasting news all day, others giving brief reports on the hour, and still others giving longer roundups in the evening. While the content of the various news media overlapped, their reports were complementary, entailing different journalistic methods, levels of detail, and political perspectives. The news formats all had their shortcomings. They rarely gave voice to opinions outside the bounds of the mainstream, and they tended to be slow to challenge the status quo. But they also had important strengths in checking facts, in investigating fraud and corruption, in putting hard questions to politicians, and in combination they gave people a shared understanding of contemporary events that was essential to a productive public sphere. When new media artifacts came along, they often opened new realms of expression, even if they were developed for commercial reasons. During the 1940s, big record companies, looking to attract new customers and counter competition from broadcast music, invested in creating a higher quality replacement for 78s, the heavy, noisy shellac records that had dominated the market for decades. RCA came up with the 7-inch single, a lightweight vinyl disc that spun at 45 revolutions per minute, and like the 78, held one song on each side. Columbia Records took a bolder approach. Ted Wallerstein, the label's president and a classical music buff, pushed his engineers to expand the capacity of records so that a single disc could hold an entire symphony. After much trial and error, they came up with the 12-inch long player, or LP, a flexible vinyl disc that turned at a leisurely 33 1/3 RPM and could accommodate 20 minutes of audio per side. The near simultaneous arrival of the two incompatible formats set off a brief standards war called the Battle of the Speeds that ended in a happy compromise. New record players came with a speed switch that allowed either format to be played. The introduction of the LP boosted record sales as intended, but it also gave recording artists a new, larger canvas to work on. It inspired songwriters and musicians to create, in addition to catchy singles, carefully sequenced suites of songs that fit the expansive LP form. By the middle of the 60s, albums like John Coltrane's A Love Supreme, the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and Love's Forever Changes were expanding the artistic possibilities of popular music and giving listeners new aural experiences. We saw in the last chapter how society, moving in fits and starts, getting some things right and some things wrong, developed a legal and regulatory framework for controlling the thrilling but unpredictable forces unleashed by electronic communication. Here we see the personal side of the story, the one that played out in living rooms, kitchens, and bedrooms. It's easy today to look back at the 20th century world of analog media and see an inefficient, fragmented mess, a mess that digitization would clean up. But the inefficiency and fragmentation served important social, intellectual, and artistic purposes. By imposing what Mark Zuckerberg disdainfully calls friction on the processes of information production, distribution, and retrieval, the specialization of media networks and devices also imposed order on the welter of information that was suddenly pouring into people's homes. The specialized technology served as a means to sort and segregate information and regulate the pace and timing of its delivery. A philosopher might say the specialized tools formed an epistemic architecture, one that aided understanding by helping people distinguish the trivial from the important, the fleeting from the enduring, the personal from the political, the factual from the fictive. Like the legal and regulatory system that surrounded it, the analog media system was imperfect, but its very messiness helped maintain communication's human scale. Its physicality and fragmentation prevented the speed and volume of electronic networks from overwhelming people's sense-making capacities. Equally important, the analog system imposed discipline on and encouraged discretion in reading, viewing, and listening habits, giving people a sense of control over the media products that were proliferating so quickly. An individual had to make a conscious decision to pick up a magazine or switch on a TV or stick a dime in a jukebox. It was impossible to do everything all at once, and no one would have wanted to. The friction, the cost, the effort, the act of choosing was part of the pleasure. Drop the coin right into the slot, sang Chuck Berry in School Days, his ecstatic 1957 single. You gotta hear something that's really hot. Mechanism and meaning. The fundamental problem of communication, wrote Bell Labs engineer Claude Shannon in A Mathematical Theory of Communication, an article published in 1948 in the Bell System Technical Journal, is that of reproducing at one point either exactly or approximately a message selected at another point. He added as an aside, frequently the messages have meaning, that is, they refer to or are correlated according to some system with certain physical or conceptual entities. And then he added as a clarification, these semantic aspects of communication are irrelevant to the engineering problem. 80 pages long and dense with arcane equations and diagrams, Shannon's article went unnoticed by the public. But as the science journalist James Gleick would later write, with only slight exaggeration, it was a fulcrum around which the world began to turn. Shannon was not suggesting that meaning doesn't matter. He just wanted to make clear that the semantic aspects of a message are immaterial to the technical aspects of its transmission. Meaning is separate from mechanism. In one sense, he was restating the old idea underlying common carriage. When a postal courier or other shipping agent took possession of a personal letter in the 18th century, He was concerned about its transport, not its content. He wanted to plot the fastest route, keep the cost of the shipment low, and temper the risk of the letter being damaged, lost, or stolen along the way. What the letter said was of no concern to him. It mattered only to the correspondents who, unless a problem arose, remained happily oblivious to the details of the letter's transport. A letter was two different things, a message with meaning and a piece of cargo. A similar duality would characterize telegrams and telephone calls. Though as information shed its material form, a carrier's technical concerns became less about navigating the world and more about processing signals and symbols. Shannon's theory of communication was esoteric, involving entropy, uncertainty, and probability, but it was aimed at solving a practical and pressing problem for his employer: how to squeeze the maximum number of phone calls through the wires of its network. Information, Shannon realized, always travels through a medium in coded form. That's true even of spoken words that go through nothing but air. The speaker's throat and mouth turn the words into sound waves, the code, and the ear of the listener decodes the waves back into words. With documents sent through the mail, speech is encoded in the letters of the alphabet. With telegrams, there's a succession of encodings. Strings of alphabetic characters are converted into strings of dots and dashes, which are then converted into an analogous or analog pattern of electrical pulses. With the telephone, a vibrating metal diaphragm converts the sound waves of speech into a continuous, and again analog, electric signal, and at the receiving end, a small loudspeaker converts the signal back into sound waves and directs them toward the listener's eardrum. Shannon further saw that every communication channel has a certain calculable capacity, its bandwidth, we now say, and a certain calculable susceptibility to distortion or noise. By manipulating transmission codes to compress messages and by adding error correction codes to counter the effects of noise, Bell System carriers could use their equipment to its fullest possible capacity. They could avoid unnecessary capital investments and turn a heftier profit. Shannon provided the math to accomplish such optimization. Before his paper, network management involved guesswork and rules of thumb. After his paper, it was a science. Industrial objectives, efficiency, standardization, automation could now be rigorously applied to human speech. Shannon intended his theory to apply to communication of all sorts, but the reason it came to have such epochal importance is that it arrived at the same time as a new kind of machine for manipulating information, the digital computer. In his article, he introduced the word bit, a contraction of binary digit. Get that, bit is a contraction of binary digit, to describe the smallest, most basic unit of information, the amount required to distinguish between two mutually exclusive and equally probable alternatives. The outcome of a coin toss, for instance, contains a single bit of information. It can be communicated with one of two digits, 0 for heads, 1 for tails. The same is true of the state of an electric switch, 0 for off, 1 for on. Because a digital computer is built of switches, binary code is ideally suited to serve as its native language, the numerical machine code that regulates its operations and expresses its logic. Shannon also saw that any information capable of being stored or transmitted by a communication mechanism, including a digital computer, can be translated into binary code. The information, whatever its original or ultimate form, can be expressed in zeros and ones. It can be broken down for purposes of transmission or storage into its most elemental units, units without any meaning, at least not to human beings. Such encoding, moreover, provides crucial advantages over other coding schemes. In addition to its flexibility, binary code offers resiliency and efficiency. Because it involves only two discrete symbols, it isn't subject to much ambiguity. It resists distortion. Static or other noise that would render human speech unintelligible is unlikely to interfere with the interpretation of a simple binary signal. The code's simplicity and clarity also make it easy to copy endlessly and perfectly. And using Shannon's algorithms or their descendants, computers can automatically compress the code, pruning away redundant or inessential bits to get the most out of a network's available bandwidth. more information can be transmitted more speedily. Though no one, not even its creator, understood the full ramifications at the time, Shannon's theory sealed media's fate. The language of computer networks would become the language of media networks. If all information can be represented by zeros and ones, then all information can be transmitted through digital computers. And if binary code is the most efficient way to transmit information, then it's only logical that all information should be transmitted through computers. Given sufficient bandwidth, a computer network would become the universal medium. All those household media gadgets would be replaced by software. With the appearance of Shannon's paper, the intricate, rickety architecture of analog media began to tremble. In 1950, 2 years after his article came out, Shannon spoke at one of the Macy conferences on cybernetics, a celebrated series of interdisciplinary symposia on communication and computing held at a Park Avenue hotel in New York. His theory was now famous among the mathematicians and information scientists in attendance. Luminaries like John Van Neumann, Norbert Wiener, and J.C.R. Licklider. In discussing his ideas, Shannon again emphasized the separation of the meaning of a message from the mechanism of its communication. Also at the conference was Margaret Mead. As the discussions continued, she began to grow uneasy with what she was hearing. Having spent years studying how groups of people make meaning through shared rituals and beliefs, through language and gesture, she wasn't quite so sure that the division between mechanism and meaning was as clean as it was being made out to be. She wondered whether the mathematical optimization of communication might not introduce a new kind of distortion, one that would skew the sense of messages or strip away nuance. If you are trying to communicate the fact that somebody is angry, she said, struggling to put her concern into the right words, what order of distortion might be introduced to take the anger out of a message that otherwise will carry exactly the same words? As mechanisms of communication are made more efficient, would subtleties of meaning get lost or garbled? Would the signal, not the noise, turn out to be the more dangerous source of distortion? There was an irony to the anthropologist's worries. It was the computer network, after all, that would come to fulfill her dream of an immersive, interactive, multimedia environment. In questioning the ideal of mathematically optimized communication, she was questioning her own ideal of a truly democratic medium. But she could not have known that in 1950 any more than Shannon or the other pioneers of digital computing could. But she could not have known that in 1950 any more than Shannon or the other pioneers of digital computing could. The commercial production of computers was just starting up, housed in large cabinets that gave them their name, mainframes. The new calculating machines were as big as dumpsters, cost millions of dollars, and couldn't communicate with each other. And I remember working for Mountain Bell in the early 1980s in the accounting building, and seeing I think it was maybe on the second floor, this big room in the middle with all these mainframe computers, huge machines. It needed a whole big room, and I mean a huge room that took up most of the floor. There may have been some offices off, probably on the sides and everything, but that big center of the second floor was all mainframe computers. And I don't remember, it could have been the first floor, I don't know. But anyway, I remember seeing those all the time, walking past them. No one, other than maybe a few science fiction fantasists, could have imagined that by the century's end, they'd shrink to the size of toaster ovens and be used to watch TV shows, listen to music, and exchange endearments and insults. The Atari 2600, a toy, would be the unlikely harbinger of the new era. With a cheap 8-bit microprocessor that generated silly sounds and images, it was the first popular digital media device to find a place in the home, a combination stalking horse and Trojan horse. The most beloved of its early cartridges was Pac-Man, and like that game's eponymous hero, digital media would soon be gobbling up everything in its path. Content collapse. In 1962, the Defense Department recruited J.C.R. Licklider to oversee ARPA's research program on information processing. In the years since the 1950 Macy Conference, the affable and ambitious Licklider, known to all as Lick, what a nickname, had become an evangelist for what he called man-computer symbiosis. He heralded a future in which human brains and computing machines will be coupled together very tightly. At ARPA, he faced a more immediate challenge, getting the machines themselves coupled together. The various data processing systems used by the agency's researchers were incompatible. They couldn't share programs or data. In 1963, he wrote a long memo to his colleagues proposing an effort to build what he termed, only half-jokingly, an intergalactic computer network. Although he would soon leave the agency to become an IBM consultant, his project took off. By decade's end, the Pentagon had the first general-purpose wide-area computer network, the ARPANET, up and running. 20 years later, having slipped free of military control, the network morphed into the Internet. What had been designed as a geeky academic research hub turned into a vast library-cum-agora, open to anyone with a modem and a web browser. In a replay of the early radio boom, Americans rushed online. And I remember Joanna and me going to Sam's, I think, in 1993. And while we were there, I was mesmerized by the sight of Prodigy, a box of Prodigy set up. So we bought it, came home and set it up with our computer, whatever that was by then. Our first one had been an IBM PC Junior. I don't know whether we had moved on from that by then, that time or not. But anyway, set that up. And before long, Bob and I were emailing each other over Prodigy. That was my introduction, really, to email. So in a replay of the early radio boom, Americans rushed online. The experience was exhilarating. Oh, yes. Another new frontier had opened, and frustrating. Connecting to the net from home meant dialing into a distant server through a noisy, low-bandwidth telephone line. Oh, yes, dial-up. Even with the fastest modem available, downloading a song took 10 minutes. Downloading a movie might tie up the family phone line for a day. Sound and picture quality were cruddy. Browsers glitchy. Streaming inconceivable. At the turn of the century, fewer than 1 in 20 Americans had a broadband link at home. But over the next few years, that number shot up as phone and cable companies upgraded their equipment and pitched affordable internet plans to their customers. By 2007, half of Americans had home broadband. By 2010, 2/3 did. I don't remember at all just what year it was when we finally moved on from dial-up to broadband, but it sure was a big difference. When personal computers first entered the home, they were standalone, multi-purpose data processing machines, high-tech Leatherman tools. You loaded a program into memory to do something useful or entertaining, write a letter, manage the family budget, play Oregon Trail with the kids, and then loaded another to do something else. All your files and data remained within the machine or on floppy disks you owned. Once connected to a broadband network, computers turned into something very different. They became media devices, home transceivers with capabilities infinitely more advanced than those of early radio sets. Unlike the specialized analog devices they replaced, computers were generalists. They could do everything. All forms of content were digitized, compressed with Shannon's formulas, and uploaded to the net. With broadband, surfing the web suddenly felt effortless. A series of clicks and taps, a fine motor choreography of summoning and dismissal, everything always at hand. Fast, efficient, rationalized new media vanquished slow, inefficient, cluttered old media. From a technological standpoint, the triumph of digital media may have been inevitable, but it didn't happen in a vacuum. It was hastened by political changes. In the early 1970s, economists and politicians began to sour on industrial regulation, viewing it as a cause of the stagflation then crippling the economy. An unfettered free market seemed the best guarantor of growth and prosperity. Government controls on many business sectors, including telecommunications and broadcasting, began to be lifted. The Nixon administration exempted cable television from the public interest standard and other programming restrictions. The Carter administration followed by deregulating radio, with the FCC declaring that the public interest would best be served by eliminating unnecessarily burdensome regulations. With Ronald Reagan's landslide election in 1980, the deregulation push gained overwhelming force. The FCC lifted programming controls from broadcast television and rescinded the Fairness Doctrine. Although the public interest standard remained in the statutes, it had lost its teeth. For the FCC, defending the public interest now meant little more than expanding consumer choice. The free market spirit permeated the sweeping Telecommunications Act of 1996. Promoted with great enthusiasm by President Bill Clinton and his technophilic Vice President Al Gore, the legislation stripped away most of the market strictures that had defined the structure of the media industry since the Communications Act of 1934. It erased the boundaries between different media markets and services, freeing phone companies, cable companies, broadcasting networks, and internet startups to compete wherever they liked. The convergence of media technology was soon mirrored by a convergence of markets, as traditional telecommunications and broadcasting firms battled tech giants and internet newcomers for dominance in digital communications. The combination of deregulation and digitization erased the legal and ethical distinction between interpersonal communication and broadcast communication that had governed media in the 20th century. When Google introduced its Gmail service in 2004, it announced with an almost imperial air of entitlement that it would scan the contents of all messages and use the resulting data for any purpose it wanted. Our new mailman would read all our mail. The public, enthralled to Google and eager for free email accounts, barely flinched. The centuries-old secrecy of correspondence doctrine was tossed aside, just as personal correspondence and conversation were moving online. On the internet, the wiretap wouldn't be a bug, it would be a feature. Internet companies were also freed of the obligation to take account of the public good. The Telecommunications Act included broad safe harbor provisions, the now notorious Section 230 that shielded internet companies from legal liability for the third-party content they disseminated. Through businesses like Google and Facebook, though businesses like Google and Facebook would soon be broadcasting into homes far more information than radio or TV stations ever did, little in the way of civic responsibility would be demanded of them. Without the constraints of either the secrecy of correspondence doctrine or the public interest standard, online media gained important marketing and legal advantages to go along with its technological edge. The government, having bankrolled the building of the internet, now guaranteed its hegemony over all aspects of communication. The Telecommunications Act did impose one constraint on internet firms. It made it a crime to use the net to circulate to minors any content that, quote, depicts or describes in terms patently offensive as measured by contemporary community standards, sexual or excretory activities or organs, end quote. Immediately challenged by the American Civil Liberties Union as an infringement on free speech rights, the anti-obscenity provision was thrown out by a federal district court in Pennsylvania. The Justice Department, under Attorney General Janet Reno, appealed the ruling to the Supreme Court, and it again fell to John Paul Stevens to write the High Court's opinion. This time, Stevens rejected the government's argument. Drawing an explicit distinction with his ruling in the Carlin case, he argued that the internet was fundamentally different from traditional broadcast networks. Whereas radio listeners might accidentally be exposed to obscene speech when tuned to a station, internet users seldom encounter such content accidentally, he wrote. Finding information on the net requires, he said, a series of affirmative steps more deliberate and directed than merely turning a dial. Minors, Stevens went on to say, lack the sophistication necessary to retrieve material from the web without the help of adults. As it turned out, children would prove to have a considerably more sophisticated understanding of the net's workings than the justice did, or adults in general. Today, the remnants of the analog would lie scattered around us, some of its artifacts such as film cameras and vinyl records. Today, the remnants of the analog world lie scattered around us. Some of its artifacts, such as film cameras and vinyl records, have even become fetish objects. But the old media system has been dismantled. The convergence of media technology hasn't just destroyed the bipartite regulatory framework and the divisions between media businesses. It has blurred the distinctions between categories of information, distinctions of form, register, sense, and importance that the epistemic architecture of the analog era preserved and even accentuated. content has collapsed, as our adoption of the drab generic term content to refer to all forms of expression testifies. Everything now has to fit the Internet's conventions and protocols, with their stress on immediacy, novelty, multiplicity, interconnectedness, and above all, efficiency. The brakes that were imposed by necessity more than design on electronic communication during the last century are gone. With digitization, communication has lost its human scale. And one thing I think I might have mentioned this in the very first session, but I should repeat this once in a while, that Superbloom, great, I just tore a page. Superbloom, let me get to the copyright page to confirm this, was published in 2025. I'm reading this now in August 2026. It was published in 2025. So it's fairly up-to-date, fairly recent book. All right, I'm going to quit there. About halfway through chapter 3, the feed. And so we'll take up there where we left off in the next session. Chapter 3, the feed of Superbloom, How Technologies of Connection Tear Us Apart, by Nicholas Carr. Thank you for watching.